Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm not really sure why there's that green line on the screen, so hopefully it's not going to bother you too much. We'll just ignore it, pretend it's not there. Um, we have 6 classes, I think, left, counting today. Today we're going to be definitely getting through the rest of emotions and initiating a discussion about self. The quotes, I have a few quotes here. As we transition from emotions and then putting everything together about the senses and memory and how we think together with emotions, we're able now to have systems that have a sense of self. From a human perspective, there's a famous quote dating back over 400 years from a French person named René Descartes, translated into English as, I think, therefore I am. So, and then that was clarified. This is supposed to mean the same thing. René Descartes was a philosopher. Antoine Leonard was someone skilled in writing, basically a writer. And he clarified what René Descartes meant by writing, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. So the idea was that if you can doubt whether you are, then you are. Because if you're not, if you don't exist, then you wouldn't be able to doubt that you exist. And so these are concepts that people have been thinking about and struggling with for a long time, trying to understand what it means to know that you exist. One here at the bottom that I just wrote up adapting that, but I'm sure I'm not the first to come up with it, is I feel, therefore I think, therefore I am. And to the extent that thinking or emotions are just another way of thinking, then we're basically saying the same thing that René Descartes said and Antoine Leonard said when we say that I feel, therefore I think, therefore I am. What those phrases allow us to do is think about at least some metric, some level at which we can create an artificial system and say that that artificial system has a self, that it has an identity of itself as a self. Moving forward, maybe the reason there are a lot of people here is they thought today was the online class. I'm not sure. Next week is the online class on Monday. So on Monday, it'll be a similar format as to today, except just watch it from wherever you can. And those are the Moodle links for the rest of April. The one that's next to online is the one for next time. The final exam, you should now well know, is the first exam on Monday morning, May 13th, in a different classroom. So don't forget it's in a different classroom. There is one student that had requested some inputs as part of their project. They wanted to do a survey. That survey is online, the link's here, but I also already put the link on Piazza. So if you have a few minutes and don't mind helping out one of your fellow students, please just go to that link and do the survey. Totally optional, but if you do it, I'm sure they'll appreciate it. As far as the reading is concerned, it's the same reading here. There will likely be some new reading between now and the end of the semester, but it would be relatively short, like an article or something along those lines, or a video, something like that. In terms of the more substantive reading, this is it. I put here in green chapter 6 because I think if you haven't already read chapter 6, you're behind. You should have read chapter 7 or be close to done with it. That's why I put it here in yellow. Certainly by the time next week weekend's over, I would expect that all of you would have started reading chapter 8. So here are our topics for today. I feel confident for a change we're going to actually get through all of them. I intentionally forced myself to not put as many slides. We had shown a graphic that one of my students had put together earlier in the semester with respect to emotions in computer science. And what we saw was that there was a big uptick in research related to emotions and computer science. This is a graphic that was put together by another group, and I don't remember offhand where this group is from. But in this graphic, they're not looking at emotions from a computer science or artificial intelligence perspective. They're looking at emotions from a decision research perspective. And decision research involves areas of business or economics or sales and marketing where people are interested in understanding how people make decisions so that they can either improve or educate with respect to improving decision-making processes, or they can maybe influence decision-making processes with a better understanding of it. So interestingly, if you go back some 30 years ago, there was relatively very little consideration of emotion in research publications or articles that related to decision-making, and certainly less so than there is now. And you can see starting somewhere in the 1998 time frame, there's a big uptake, and then another big uptake sort of in the 2001, 2002 time frame, followed by some additional growth. So I'm going to show shortly here what some of those activities are and what they relate to, and why people doing research in the field of decision making, at least what sorts of activities they were researching as it related to emotions. But before that, I want to get some of your thoughts and inputs in terms of, from this time frame, recognizing that some of you were born right around in this time frame. There's been more involvement in emotions, and before that time frame, you could almost say there was no involvement in emotions. So not so much explaining, although I'm happy to take inputs here, explaining why there was an uptake starting in that mid-1990s to late 1990 time frame. But I'm more interested really here in the context of decision making. What are some of the aspects or characteristics of emotions that you think might make it important now to decision making, people studying decision making? So unfortunately, there's not 24 people in here today, so I'm going to be looking at the 8 of you that are here to help me jot down here some things that you think, if you're in the business of studying decision making, so you're studying people that make decisions or how people make decisions in the business world, in the finance world, sales, marketing, all these types of things. Why might you need to think about emotions, and what type of research activity might you want to do to understand the impact of emotions in decision making? That's the question. Yes.
Globalization plays an important part in emotions before. You know, we in the United States at the time of that, we didn't have much importance of emotions. That was probably, you wouldn't, emotions wouldn't be heard in some themes or situations. If you look at your own culture, for example, everyone would be the same in the United States about economy, but maybe that in, I don't know, Russia is different. And since the thousands to, I don't know, now, we have like a revolution of communication where I could talk to anyone in the world, and their emotions towards some things are not going to be the same as mine. And so, putting trying to search for a generalized view of emotion is important because of that. Because I can talk to someone from the other part of the world about a thing, and maybe here we're able to think something because here we are raised in the same culture, we go to the same schools, the same things. But there, the experience is different, so they have a different view of whatever I'm trying to discuss with them. So it is important to study emotion because of that. I think the fact that we can talk about one and not having a bias is important to have good international communication.
I'll capture that here. Okay. That was really good. I put that here basically to more succinctly capture the idea. But the idea is that prior to 20 years ago, it wasn't as easy or as common to have regular communications with people that were very as different or different from you culturally or from the same country. And so the idea is that now that those communications are so much more common, that maybe we are more exposed to that being a variable with respect to decision making.
Now we are in a state that even if you're not at work, you're like, doing stuff in your free time, you communicate when you go to work. So the study of emotion is important. They may react to some things that you are not expecting to react to that way. But you understanding that emotion plays a big part in whatever their take is on a team, that makes communication easier, more empathic, I would say. Empathic is really emotion. Feeling, not judging just because of you think is correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, who else has something they want to offer here? Again, it can be something that's different now, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. It could just be a reason that exists why people who are studying decision making are purposefully including emotions as part of their considerations when they're doing the research.
and it's a necessary event, and it's an argument, and some people are starting to think about whatever they want. So it's important to know that emotions have a big role inside of the thing.
Okay, I'm going to capture it there. Basically, you in the example you gave an example where there was a decision that was going to be made, and it was pretty obvious that there were factors involved in that decision based on emotions experienced in a social environment. So I call that theme, decision research theme, emotional influence in decision making. We put one more up here.
Income generation have different things according to the experience of the world. I think it is important to understand the emotional, the emotional influence in the coming generation. Like I think that coming generations weight a lot of their decision on emotion as compared to like 20 years ago where I was the boss of a company, I may not necessarily think what I felt my decision was. I just made the decision thinking about now you can see how companies are accepting, that people buy their hair because they feel comfortable with it, so they dye their hair in a certain color. Some companies now are overly looking the individual, as long as you feel good. So I think it is important for companies, it is important that their employees or the coworkers feel they are good emotionally. So that's another reason I invest a lot in studying emotion. Maybe I was a CEO of a company and I would want all my coworkers to be emotionally. So, research method, or looking to how I can near their job experience. So
Okay, very good, thank you. I put it there as increasing individuality in business and work, but just as one example of generational generational changes. These here, the next couple slides have 8 themes, so the same group, and it was a Harvard group I can see from looking at the bottom, so I think this was Jennifer Lerner. The same group that looked at this trend of increasing considerations of emotion and decision-making research also dug deeper and categorized the research paper. Basically, they found that most of that growing set of research publications and decision-making related to emotions fit into one of 8 general categories. And these are the categories that they came up with. The first category is called integral emotions influence decision-making. And so these are papers that were studying decision-making when the emotion itself was part of the decision. So there's not necessarily a fine or a big separation between some of these categories may overlap. But the example that you had given about buying a car, that emotion, you were having emotions that were integral to buying the car. felt that if you bought a certain car, you might have even an emotional award associated with that. And if you bought another car, maybe someone else might be happier with that. And so the emotions were a part of that decision. Two sub areas within integral emotions that were a part of this research base or have been a part are beneficial guide and bias. Beneficial guide means studying where emotions help, integral emotions help in making the decision. So what about having an emotional experience allows you, when that emotion is integral to the decision, to make a better decision? Under what circumstances does that happen? And I think that's an interesting take, because a lot of emotion research, as you'll see towards the end here, in the past has focused more on how to control or manage emotions, how to make decisions in the absence of emotions. So this is looking at it completely different, saying, well, emotions are a part of decision making, so now I want to understand how we can best take advantage of that in decision making. The second regards bias, and biases meaning if what the integral emotion that's part of the decision is a quote negative emotion, or one that would make you feel bad, then how does that bias the decision that you're going to make? And are there inherent biases if you're going to lose something when you make the decision versus if you're going to win something when you make the decision? This can be important oftentimes in economic theories where people may make an investment, for example, because they don't want to miss out on something. So they, they decide not to make a decision to invest because they don't want to lose their investment. And so those are the types of biases that one might study to see if, given certain scenarios, people are more likely to make a decision because of that emotional bias. Incidental emotions influencing decision making. Incidental emotions are emotions that are not integral to the actual decision. There are some examples of this in a previous class where we were talking about the French toast and the experiences and the emotions that I had experienced as time passed, and whether or not that influenced my emotion in deciding what I was going to do at different points in time after that. So sort of the emotional baggage that you bring to a decision that may be independent of it. So it's well known from previous research studies that judges that are evaluating whether a prisoner is going to get parole before lunchtime tend to deny parole more often than judges after lunchtime. So that's an example of potentially an incidental emotion where maybe their thinking is influenced by the fact that they're hungry, and that leads to an unrelated bias in the decisions that they make. And then moderating factors just being a factor of making the decision. And what are the factors that moderate when incidental emotions influence decisions? Valence we talked about last class. There's quite a bit of study now in decision research looking at other aspects of emotion. If you go into projected them on different axes beyond valence, some examples last time we talked about were familiarity with an experience, whether or not you liked the experience, We talked about whether or not the emotion felt dominating, like an anger emotion, or whether it was more submissive, like a fear emotion. So looking at emotions without, in a non-basic discrete manner, but not necessarily just whether or not they feel good or feel bad and how intense they are. Another aspect of that is what's called appraisal tendencies. And this is to say, excuse me, if you have a certain emotion, are there commonalities when people have emotions in terms of how they look at things or what they're likely to do? And so obviously if you're looking at decision making, and you can see, regardless of the emotion, that there's at least commonality in what people tend to decide to do, then that can be important. In green here, and I put it in green because this most relates to one of the central topics of our course, which relates to emotions shaping decisions via the content of thought. And that is, in some sense, decision-making research has always really looked at thought, either conscious or subconscious thought, even if it's been more focused on rational or logical thought. So to the extent that emotions are another way of thinking, and now we look at thinking as comprising some combination of more logically oriented thought and more emotionally oriented thought, then the question becomes, what is the nature of that thought? How does our thinking change when we're having emotional experiences? Or how do we think either the same or different when the content of our thought is more emotionally related? For other themes in emotion decision research, emotions shape decisions via the depth of thought. The idea being here that it's kind of looking at the trade-offs between logic and emotional thinking, but thinking, okay, when you're having an emotional experience, it takes away from your ability to devote that same working memory, if you will, to the non-emotional aspects of that decision-making. And so that's what we mean when we say depth of thought. And it kind of makes sense if, in some respects, if you have a certain mental capacity to think and a certain working memory to access when you think, and to the extent you're thinking about things that have a high emotional content, well, it kind of makes sense that that is taking away mix, if you will, or computing, processing cycles from your brain and your mental memory away from logical thinking that may be oriented around thinking about something that's very complex or intricate or deep. Emotions shape decisions via goal activation. That's similar to what we talked about before in terms of our mapping things out and seeing if there's tendencies associated with certain aspects of emotions or certain emotional concepts. But here is really looking at not so much the emotion in a classical sense, but what sorts of things do emotions tend to cause someone to do. That's called an action tendency, or motivate someone to do, which is a motivation. The seventh theme is emotions influence interpersonal decisions. We'll talk about this in later classes, not today, as we go into external agents and looking at interactions of self with others. And that's where we've talked about it in the context before in the class of the influence tactics. Right? So this is where your interactions with some other entity, another human, another animal, a computing device, a floor, vacuum cleaning robot, is going to create influences and decisions that you make. If you don't like that your floor vacuum robot, if you have one of these things. Does anybody have one of these things or seen them? The little thing you put on the floor and it moves around. There's computer scientists. You must get one. So we have one at the house, and we basically push a button or you program it. iRobot's a popular brand. Ours is an iRobot. It's a generic brand. You press a button and it just starts basically wandering around your house, vacuuming. And it has some intelligence associated with it that helps it as it guides itself. It's got sensors that helps it identify obstacles. Sometimes it will bump into the obstacles. Sometimes it'll bump into it slowly. Sometimes it'll, depending on the algorithms used, they'll create a bit of a map so that it tends not to bump into things as often anymore. And so if you have one of these things and you use it, you may see yourself actually creating some emotional attachment with it or ascribing some emotional properties to it. So that's an area of research that people pursue. So it's not just interpersonal interactions with humans, but also with inanimate objects. And so if you see that your robot's getting stuck on the curtains or something, it could cause an emotional response for you. You say, oh, my robot's always getting stuck on the curtains. And you might start referring to it as, oh, let me see what it's doing now. Or where it's got stuck, or where it lost itself, attributing same sentences that are common to what you would say if you were talking about a person or an enemy. And then the last one here, and we'll have an awake slide after this, which means audience participation, related to how to reduce unwanted effects of emotion. This has really been, I would say, the classical, always present part of decision-making research when emotions have been considered, which is to say, okay, how do we make sure that we're not being too emotional in our decisions, making processes. Some of the techniques that are studied are time delay, creating an emotional stimulus, and then seeing how people make decisions, either integral or not integral to that emotion, if they have to make the decision a short period of time later or a longer period of time later. Suppression basically has them experience an emotion and then very quickly have the study participants say, not have an opportunity to really think much more about that emotion by having them think about something else, and then seeing how that impacts decisions that they make after that point in time. So you could give someone an example, or they could see something that happened that was really unfair. You might have a simulation where you have a group of people here and someone outdoor gets their purse or computer bag stolen or something. So it's emotional. You might be angry that this person had that happen to them, and now you're being asked to decide some other things in the study. Reappraisal is a process where you have an emotional experience and then you can actively have a person think about that experience in a different way. It can be a silver lining reappraisal where you say, well, at least this didn't happen. Well, the good news is that if you follow the news coverage of Notre Dame after it happened last class, you may see some article titles that are in line with reappraisal. So instead of saying, this thing is horrible and will never be the same, the title may be, these sculptures were saved, or the damage is going to be repaired in a shorter period of time. So basically it's the same event, right? Whatever happened, happened. But now looking at it from a different perspective. A traditional way of or a traditional reference to this might be the glass being half full or glass being half empty. And if you haven't heard this, is where you take literally a glass of water or whatever, and you ask people to describe the glass. And some people would say, well, it's a glass half full of water. And other people might say, it's a glass half empty of water. It's the same glass. Reappraisal means looking at it in a different light. And you'll see why this, that's actually something that's a theme in perspective science, where as we put everything together and we want to try to drive our mental processes and our thoughts, our emotional thoughts, it can be helpful to force ourselves to reappraise whatever it is we're thinking about. Look at it in a different way. This will be helpful also for artificial systems if they're not making progress by running algorithms or trying things in a certain way. It may be good to reappraise it and start looking at things in another way to see if they can overcome that problem. Dual emotion solution. I think that this relates to ascribing more than one emotion to a scenario, but I'm not 100% sure. In ascribing more than one emotion to a scenario, you basically try to break Lisa's mental concept. So if you put a word to the concept, the idea is you experience that emotion. Now you say, well, I'm angry because that's the word I'm going to use. A dual emotion solution might be where you ascribe more than one concept to the same thing, so you don't allow it to be basically put into a single bucket. Now, the exercise we're going to go through here as a class is taking how to reduce unwanted effects of emotion and use that for other types of decisions that we make. So if we wanted to, for example, reduce unwanted effects of urges to eat, what are some of the things that we might do to try to keep ourselves from eating when we have an unwanted urge to eat? So an example of this is I was going up to my office in S701. Some of you have been there, some of you haven't come by yet. And because I came in through the ground floor, I walked by that vending machine. And I had change in my pocket. And they have such a good selection there. To me, it's almost impossible not to find something in that vending machine that you like. So I bought something, and from both vending machines, the one with drinks and the one without. And I bought things that probably I really shouldn't be eating, and I don't really want to eat, but I had kind of an urge to do it. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, I got to go all the way up to the 7th floor. My office is kind of small, and it's kind of lonely in there. So wouldn't it be nice to have some cookies and a Fanta grape soda? So I had an unwanted effect and an urge to eat, which I did take care of. I did buy those cookies, and I did buy the Fanta soda, and I went up and consumed both of them. That's just one example. So what are some, how might you reduce unwanted effects of urges to eat? Say it again? Sorry.
Carry a bottle of water. Usually when I have an urge to eat, I just eat capable of water and fill it. So, I think it's easy.
That captures it. But here, carry a bottle of water around and use it as an urge antidote. I'll let you know I had 2 full bottles of water on me at the time. I didn't think about opening one up and just gulping it to see how it would be. Yes.
About benefits of eating that maybe maybe you could eat it as maybe as a reward after doing something instead of
Anything else? Go back one slide here. We had time delay, suppression, reappraisal, and dual emotion solution. Or maybe the carry bottle water is like a suppression. Time delayed, deferring as a reward. And whether maybe you just don't go buy the machine again and you don't have it. And reappraisal, I think that fits actually in thinking about the benefits of not eating it. So in some ways, these tactics, if you will, that people study to try to separate out decision making from emotional experience can also fit into urges. We'll do one more. So again, we want, and we don't have to just think about reappraisal, suppression, and time delay, but to the extent that they work, that's fine. So now we're looking at a different urge, which is the urge to sleep in. So you guys are young, so this probably never happened to you. The alarm goes off. You don't really want to get out of bed. You just want to keep sleeping. And you convince yourself, or whatever happens, you just keep sleeping. So alarm goes off, you're at least, you have some awakeness, so you are having some thinking. And so what are some of the things that you might do or think about to reduce the unwanted effects of the urges to sleep in?
I used to force myself to do at least like 10 push-ups. Exercise, that's about
More alarms. I used to have, I don't know if you've seen these old style, they're really old, but I got them when they were retro a long time ago. It's got like 2 little bells on top. The clock's round. It's got 2 little bells. It literally has like a hammer in between it that like bangs the bells. Have you ever seen this? It's the most obnoxious like alarm that you could possibly hear. And I would put it across the room, so there's really no way I could snooze the alarm without just getting out. And I think it worked for a long time, mostly because I was in the dorm and I felt bad if I didn't turn it off right away, because I felt like it would wake up the guy in the room next to me. So more alarms. One more?
for walks, but the alarm will be just down. So
Oh. So what do you think the idea is there? What are they trying to do? Why do you think that might work?
It's a green flow. Usually when you want to go back to city, it's because you're going to go activity. So once you are in the activity, like push up for you go back for a bit more.
Good. Those are really good. I'm going to delete this next one because I think we covered that. So the main takeaway I want you to have from there relates to, and I actually don't think it could have been done any better than the example you gave. Those two examples fit perfectly here because one relates to physiology, right? That's a part of thinking and emotions. And the other one relates to thought, which is also a part of thinking and emotions. And I think it just reinforces the points we talked about earlier today in terms of your working memory having some limited capacity to think, and to the extent that those thoughts are comprised of emotional and quote non-emotional thoughts, things that affect the actual thinking process or things that affect the body influence emotions the same way that they would when you're eating or have an urge to eat, or when you're trying to get out of bed or trying to wake up and you have an urge to not do that. So. Okay. So despite the green line being there, we're not crossing out behavior, posture, eye movements. Let me put it on and big scale again. Okay. So as it relates to AI research, still sort of with the classical view with some caveats, there's really three central themes. And this is going to fit into the models that at some point we're going to create or revise for perception that include emotional thinking, emotional aspects. The three are recognition, expression, and neuroscience. And recognition and expression are basically the output of you and the output of your artificial system. Recognition is what comes into your system as it sees what other people are doing in response to emotional experiences. Expression is what you are doing or what your system is doing to communicate outwards. And neuroscience is what's going on inside. So this fits really nicely in the kinds of models that we created for the last exam, where we had either your brain, what's going on inside, what's coming in and what's going out, or you had your worldview, and you had what was coming in through your senses, and then what was coming out in the context of your decisions that you were making. Same thing here. From a traditional standpoint, we think that recognition is because emotions are expressed. And so it's only a matter of understanding that outward expression of that emotion in terms of a facial expression. So we might think of a system in which they exist now where you can have a camera, take a picture, take a video, and the system will predict if the person's happy or sad. Those are facial expressions. And AI is used for that. But we know that those facial expressions aren't unique, and that a given facial expression without context isn't going to Even if you have the best AI algorithm, it's not going to tell you whether that person's happy or sad because they may have the same outward facial expression when they're happy, and in some cases they may have it when they're sad. Physiological means that you're taking something related to that person's physiology, which means a heart rate, a breathing rate, a skin conductance measurement, whether or not they're sweating, and using that to recognize what someone's feeling. And again, it isn't to say that you can't do useful things with facial expression and physiology. You can. What it's saying is that for these approaches of facial expressions, physiology, behavior, and verbal, they're more like clues or inputs into an AI algorithm really that needs to consider much more than facial expressions, physiology, behavior, and tones of voice. So all these things combined together still aren't going to give you conclusively what a person is feeling, but to the extent that you want to have a good idea of what they're feeling or what their emotional thoughts are, weighing all those and considering all those within your algorithms is going to be important to having a more consistently correct prediction. Expression is basically taking the inverse of recognition and saying, okay, now I have a system and I want my system, even though it's an artificial system, to be liked by my human user. And so if I am a voice response system, I might want to use tones in my synthesized voice that makes it sound like I care more about you as a user, even though I'm just a computer system. If it's a physical system like we saw earlier in the class, then you might use rubber facial expressions so that they look more human-like, with the idea that you might tap into what humans are already used to being able to interpret some way, or at least do interpret some way. And behavioral, being posture and gestures, and we also saw this in the case of the robot, where there was not only, where the operating system not only changed the mechanics of the face, project some sentiment, but also changed the aspects of how the robot was either standing or how they were moving their arms. Neuroscience relates to the study of what's going on in the brain. It's obviously very limited for practical reasons. One is that if you want to get the kind of data that we showed earlier in the class, slices of the neurons and the compositions and the chemical composition, you really have to have a dead brain or recently dead brain set up. In terms of studying what's happening to a live person, ethically you're constrained, practically you're constrained. Even if you want to do MRI measurements to get signals from inside the brain, you still have to put them in an MRI machine, which isn't a really natural environment. So it takes them away from a kind of environment where they are going to experience more genuine emotions. Limited, I've been in an MRI machine. Has anybody been in an MRI machine? Yeah. I don't know, they have two different machines. I've been in both. The older style machine, I call it the coffin because it literally is as big as you are. And when you go into it, you're all into it. Your eyes are very close to the border of the machine. Were you all in that kind of a machine? Yes? Close one. Were you in a close one? They actually now have one that's further away.
Actually,
I can tell you that if I had had emotional sensors attached to me, people would have seen emotions related to claustrophobia or some agitated, uncomfortable state. I wasn't very happy in that machine. So you can imagine how hard it can be to try to get people to experience different types of emotions in an artificial kind of environment like that. You could say, well, I'm going to pick patients that don't suffer those types of systems, but then in a way you don't have regular population in your sample. Right? You have people within your sample that, by definition, don't suffer from those types of symptoms. So you're already looking at people that may have differences in their emotional thoughts. We know already there are no specific neural sources, no innate neural signatures. I'm going to try to flip this up so you can see the other stuff. No direct access to thoughts inclusive of emotional experience. And that emotional thoughts, emotions, are dynamic and not inherently replicable. And you can see the same video, have an emotional response, see the same video again, and not have the same emotional response. Because part of emotional response has to do with surprise or something that's different than the norm. So how do we quantify emotions for artificial intelligence systems? Good news is fairly straightforward now that we understand how emotions work in human beings and what their functions are, at least to some extent. In terms of classification, in some respects we avoid classification because we know the limitations of classifications that we talked about before. And in a way that helps us with artificial systems because I don't have to say, okay, I'm going to make my artificial system angry necessarily, because we know that that's a word that's a discrete emotion, and angry isn't necessarily always angry. Right? You can start now to say, okay, I'm going to create situations that in my artificial environment that cause my system to experience something that's like what a human would experience when they're angry from a thinking perspective. Right? So you may do things when you're angry towards the source of anger, for example. So we look at things from what's called a one-dimensional continuum. I'll show you an example of this from work from Stanford from some years ago, where we don't worry about classifying the emotion. We just want to have a measure of that emotional experience. We don't worry about if the emotional experience is positive or negative. We don't worry about whether it's someone that's angry or happy. We just want to see that they're having an emotional experience. That means that their thought processes have a component that's emotional in nature. That's substantive, that's significant. We don't worry about whether it's good or bad, we just worry about the intensity of it. And then we can focus on it being continuous and time dependent. So that as I wake up and go through an experience of trying to start preparing for the class, and then with an experience of making French toast someone else's way, I can see how my thought process and its emotional composition is varying over time as different things happen. So the ODC model, one-dimensional continuum, avoids classification altogether, and it presumes that emotional experience is comprised of a form of thinking, and thus is time and contextually dependent. So experience is different depending on the initial state. And this initial state can be the result of a previous state. Experience is different depending on the context, who's around. You may manage your emotional experience and your emotional thinking differently if one of your parents is around, or if a good friend is around, maybe even if a professor is around, as opposed to if a professor is not around, for example. And function is time varying, dependent upon all of your thought, your experience, and what you do with that emotional experience is going to be different depending on what you happen to be thinking about. If you're thinking about something that's kind of a priority, you may be able to shift your thinking back to that priority because it happens to be important. We saw this in the Sully video from the airplane that was taken off in New York and landed in the river, right, in the Hudson. Wasn't that that person wasn't experiencing emotions. They certainly were experiencing emotions the whole time. It was that they were able to prioritize their thinking and not shut out emotions, but focus their thinking on emotions that were consistent with the thinking that they wanted to have in order to accomplish the task. So maybe emotions oriented around, hey, I want to be successful here. I know I can do this. I'm ready for this. I've got a plan versus panic. Oh my gosh, we're going to all perish here. We're going to crash. Let me see what I can do, right? So shifting those thoughts, still thoughts, to emotional thoughts that are maybe more productive with the goal. And this is what it looks like in practice using that approach. The solid line is called an amusement experience, and the dashed line is called amusement behavior. Amusement experience is a measure of ODC, one-dimensional, that we talked about here in another slide, the one-dimensional continuum. It's looking at the intensity. Both of them are looking at the intensity, but when I want to explain how these are done, because they're done differently. The emotional experience, the solid line, is done by the user themselves. So if they're in an experience, maybe watching a video, watching a movie, and they're feeling an emotion that's somewhat intense, they'll literally move a dial in one direction, maybe clockwise, or maybe a knob in one direction. And if it gets more intense, they'll move it more in that direction. And if they start feeling like a little bit more relaxed or bored, then they'll move it in the opposite direction. So that's what these people did over the course of the 5 minutes or so here to generate that solid line, the amusement experience. So this is just the output of that knob. The dashed line is an average result of a set of judges that were observing the person, not observing what they were doing with the knob, but just observing the person physically, their facial expressions, whether or not they were moving around, whether or not they were changing positions, maybe whether they were leaning forward in their chair or jerking back. And what they were doing there is similarly with the knob, but they're not looking at the video, they're looking at what the person's doing, their behavior. And you can see here that there's some correlation basically between what's observable externally, what that person is communicating by observable features, and the judges are seeing, with what that person is feeling inside that's causing them to move the knob based on what they're seeing. So that's really encouraging, and that correlations like this can be found over time because we know that those emotional experiences are changing over time. If you did this same experience and had them tell you how they were feeling, you could see how at any given point in time, it would be hard to come up with more than one one word, right? Or even over areas of time. So the idea here is that it seems that emotional experiences are continuous, that if you were going to ascribe labels to them, they would be changing very quickly. And so that studying emotions from a steady state classification perspective is maybe uh, not as effective a tool in terms of creating real-time systems as looking at it from a one-dimensional continuum perspective. So for AI, now we can finally state what the rules are. When we have, this is the slide that I modified 2 times before. Once showing you the original version, and then once showing you what it would look like with the constructed emotion concepts. Now I'm showing it what it looks like when you want to construct an artificial system. When you want to construct an artificial system, you look at emotions characterized by not as something that happens to you, but something that you think. And I'm going to translate this one more time. So it's something that you're doing. You're thinking, it's something that you're computing. So that's the analogy we want. We want to look at it from an intensity or percent contribution of logical computing versus a different kind of computing. Percent contribution of logical, rational thinking versus an emotional thinking. We want to look at occurrences because we know emotions have an aboutness, and that aboutness is related to occurrences. That's something that's tangible that we can measure in the environment that we're in, right? Or access to the memories that our system is accessing when it's doing its computations. They can let it evaluate and influence the decision that that system is going to make. Right? That system doesn't have the ability, and I can't fathom that it can, maybe someday it will, to in real time process everything. Right? The reason real-time natural language processing works is because there's already models that are built. Right? So what's happening in that real-time moment is not rebuilding that model. And it doesn't rebuild the model. What does it mean? It means it has a built-in assumption. Right? It has a semi-autonomous entity in the cloud that's going to give you whatever answer it's going to give you, whether it's right or wrong, similar to what we do in real time. It's a multi-component experience that has 4 things. It's subjective, meaning that whether it's computational or thought-oriented, it has an output that is going to depend on what's going on. It's got body aspects associated with it. These are system aspects. The robot may not do certain things if it knows it doesn't have enough power to do certain things, right? Or if it knows that it hasn't been able to do certain things it believed it could do recently. So maybe there's something wrong with some part of the robot. Verbal, non-verbal communication, we know it has that aspect. It's communication, not expression or recognition. And then thought and cognition, which we're going to call probabilistic computing with uncertainty. So when you're making emotional decisions in a computing environment, you're making probabilistic computations with uncertainty. It means you can't say definitively this is the right result. And this is the last last 2 slides. This is the framework that we're going to use. And I thought I could get through everything. I'm just going to show them here. In the next class, we'll start here. So I'm just going to at least show you these 2 slides. Emotions in AI systems need to have these attributes for them to work in a way that's analogous to how they work in a human system. The AI system has to be in real time having expectations. It has to compute what it thinks should be happening. And when something happens that's different, very different than what it thought should happen, it needs to resolve that error. And when it resolves that error, it needs to learn from that so that the next time it experiences that, it's better prepared to make that prediction. So it takes less time to respond to that situation. So it's a learning opportunity just as it is for us when something happens that's totally different than what we would expect. It has to have systems that drive attention. So when expectations are off, you know humans are going to have emotions. These systems are going to have artificial emotions that are going to drive its attention. It knows that, hey, I just predicted something that's off. I need to kind of focus my real-time processing with this. I need to maybe take away processing I'm devoting to thinking about something else, moving. Maybe I want to stop myself. Because again, it, just like you, doesn't have and won't have completely unlimited resources when we constrain time. Every artificial computing system has a time constraint, has a processing constraint when you limit time, even if you use cloud resources. And so that has to drive attention and motivation to what it should do to respond to that problem. It has to be individual, meaning that the system has to be semi-autonomous, meaning it's not pre-programmed to do a certain thing. Why is that important? Because no programmer is going to have access to everything that that artificial system has to deal with that situation at the time. So I can't predict that the robot all of a sudden is going to have, you know, a tree that's fallen down in front of it, and a fruit and a dog running towards it. I can't predict that. So I can't pre-prepare that robot to handle that situation. Right? So I have to prepare it to make decisions in that circumstance to see what the outcome is and learn from it. And then finally, the system has to be mortal. It cannot reboot because it can never be in the state that it's going to be based on the experiences that it has had. That mortality has to drive the attention and motivation of the system to not perish, to not allow something to happen to itself that's going to cause it to perish. So these are simple concepts in some way that you can think about having in an artificial system that have complete analogs in emotion, living, biological systems. So if we're successful here, and we've been successful in this class, you should be at a point here where you can say, you know what, I can actually implement an emotion in an artificial system because I can model what emotional attributes do to the computational parts of my system, and I know what characteristics my artificial system have, and I can communicate that without talking about feelings and angry and types of things that that maybe aren't as useful in terms of understanding how emotions work truly. So this is just for you to look at for next time. I'll cover that last slide and this slide because they're basically almost like the conclusion of emotions and AI, so they're really important for this. But here what I've done is I took that old slide of recognition, expression, and neuroscience, crossed out and added in green how we want to look at this from an artificial system standpoint. We don't want to look at recognition. We want to look at interpreting the communications of others. And to the extent our system can look at facial expressions, physiology, behavior, verbal, and nonverbal coming from others, we want to use that to interpret. We want to look at it as a communication, not an expression. We want to communicate to another person. We understand that if we communicate in a monotonic voice, we're not going to be as effective as communicating if we use other tools like gestures, tones of the voice that we use. And then finally, as we think about what we're going to put inside this computing system, whether it's a mobile system or not, we want to think about what is going on in the brain. And so we want to use our understanding of what's going on in the brain to think about how we construct these algorithms, how we construct the operating systems, and what we require of the emotional thinking within our artificial system. We can't hold the emotional thinking in our artificial system to the same standards that we use for our logical systems. If we do, we're going to create logical computing systems and not emotional artificial systems. I'll leave it there.